So I want to welcome you to the second webinar of the Community Psychology Practice and Undergraduate Settings Interest Group. We're really happy that you're here. I'm Jen Wallen-Rushman, and along with Lauren Lichty, who's also on, we're the co-chairs of this interest group. And really, this idea for this interest group, or this idea for this webinar came to us. We had a call with our interest group back in November, talking about teaching, talking about pedagogy, exploring ideas where we could grow as a community psychology pedagogy, and the idea of exploring intersectionality and how intersectionality can help us understand pedagogy and intersectional pedagogy broadly. Felt like it would be a really beneficial topic for us. So the first person we reached out to was Dr. Desdamona Rios here, and she was so kind to say yes. We're just so happy to have her here for her expertise and skills to share with us. So our speaker today is, as I just said, Dr. Desdamona Rios, and she is an associate professor of psychology and director of the Latinx and Latino American Studies program at the University of Houston Clear Lake. She holds a joint doctorate in psychology and women's studies from the University of Michigan. She's a recipient of 3 national teaching awards from the Division II, the Teaching Division, Division 9 Society for Psychological Studies, and also Division 35, the Association for Women in Psychology, and also a Legacy Award for her work with underrepresented groups in academia. So just another quick procedural note is about the first kind of half of the webinar. Desi's going to be talking to us. Dr. Rios is going to be talking to us about intersectional pedagogy, intersectional theory, and those things. So if you have, she's really open to questions. So if you want to unmute your microphone and ask a question, that's fine. If you're a little more hesitant to do that, I invite you to, at the bottom, you can click the chat feature, and it'll open up the box to the side of your screen. And so you can actually send a message to me. So it says J. Wallen-Rushman up there, that's me. You can send a message to me and I will I'll be asking questions.
Is that, okay. It's one of our friends in the background. Okay. Hello.
Yeah.
Is it my turn? Okay. Thank you for inviting me. So I'm going to talk about intersectional pedagogy. So just to give you a quick overview of what I'm going to cover, I'm going to frame this within APA guidelines for the psychology major. So thinking about the goals that most of us have or should have. Thinking also about how do we engage all students in the classroom, especially when we are addressing social issues. Sometimes students may feel resistant. Or feel like I'm here to study psychology. What does this have to do with what's happening on the border? I will then talk about what is an intersectionality, this word we hear tossed around all the time these days. And then also using our classrooms as sites, not only for thinking about social issues, but using intersectionality within our classrooms for doing social justice work. But also for understanding people in context, which is, I know, especially important to community psychologists. So before I do that, I want to share with you a little bit about my background so that you understand where I'm coming from, my sources of knowledge. So I've been educated and I've also taught at different types of institutions. As a graduate student, I taught at the University of Michigan. This is a large selective research institution, primarily white, located in the Midwest. My first teaching job out of graduate school at Bowdoin College. This is a small, also selective liberal arts college, also primarily white, located in New England. And now I am at the University of Houston Clear Lake. This is a very different type of institution. It's open enrollment. It is medium size. It is a comprehensive university, Hispanic serving, located in the South. So as you can imagine, I've taught different types of students, including social class, race, and also heading down into the South, political affiliation. So it's been an interesting journey. I'm originally from Los Angeles, so these are very different places that I've had the opportunity to not only live, but also teach. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about APA guidelines for the undergraduate psychology major. So goal 3 asks us to think about the ethical and social responsibility that not only that we have in the world, but also how we're preparing our students. And so in this section, APA suggests that we move away from simply recognizing difference and singular identities. So in the manual, they advise that diversity also comprises intersections among the social identities and the social power differences that are associated with diverse identities and multiple contexts. They also argue that they believe diversity, or we believe diversity issues should be infused throughout the undergraduate learning goals and outcomes. And you see here I have certain words highlighted because these are what I'm going to be focusing on throughout the talk. If you notice, can you all see that my little POW thing? Okay, I'm not sure because I can see everybody's faces on the right side of my screen. So if you notice, a lot of these words either are using the word power, but also there's privilege in there. And I'll talk a little bit about what privilege means within our field. So again, goal 3 is about the ethical and social responsibility in a diverse world. So moving away from simply recognizing difference and singular identities, thinking about intersections, power, multiple contexts, but also how are we going to infuse this throughout the undergraduate learning goals and outcomes. And so as I was writing this talk, I was thinking about core values in community psychology, which include social justice for all individuals, empowering marginalized individuals and communities, embracing and promoting diversity in communities, understanding of human behavior in context, and improving the quality of life of individuals. And this may involve understanding the organization, the institution, or another social setting in which that person is living. And so before I move on, I wanted everyone to think about how you are addressing diversity in your courses so far. So think about one key concept you teach. So we all have that one that we love in a particular course. And think about, have you been moving away from simply recognizing difference and singular identities? Have you been moving away from, well, women experience it this way, men experience it that way? So are you moving away from that to understanding perhaps intragroup differences? So Black men and women are perhaps different than white men and women. Intersections among social identities, so considering power differences associated with those diverse identities and multiple contexts. Of course, white men's experiences are not going to be the same as Black men's experiences. So thinking about power. And then how are you infusing diversity throughout the undergraduate curriculum? So have you all been trying to do that, or is it only in the module on psychology of women? Or psychology of race and discrimination? Okay. All right, so moving on. But just a few things to start thinking about. So I want to tell you a story about my own teaching experience and how I really started to work. I've always been thinking about these issues, but a couple of students in particular inspired me to really go back to the drawing board. So while early in my career I was teaching, and a student, African-American woman, her research interests are on resilience, coping, single Black mothers. She was raised by one in the South. She's now a doctoral student in counseling psychology. And she asked me to lunch, and so I met her one day, and I had just sat down, and she said to me, why did you stay in the field? She was very serious. Why did you stay in the field? And I said, could you elaborate a little bit on that question? And she started to explain that in her classes, she had been learning about, except on the week on discrimination, she felt the field was about white people and for white people. And unless it was talking about deficiencies of certain groups or prejudice. And that she had wanted to do an honors thesis on resilience, coping, single Black mothers, and her psychology advisor suggested that she might want to switch to Africana studies, because that wasn't really psychology. And so this question, why did you stay in the field, really struck me. And so I shared with her, you know, the wonderful work that so many of us do. And so she ended up staying in our field. So the second student is Juan, and he's a Mexican-American man. His research interests are coming out, the coming out process across race and ethnic groups, but also social class. So he's now a doctoral student in developmental psychology. And when I first met him, he came to my class, to my office hours, and he had this idea that perhaps some people don't come out because some identities might be privileged, and in the context of culture, that might not seem an appropriate way to present yourself, but that his friends in his college, he's a generation college student, working class, that his friends were insisting that he needed to come out to his family. And as he's telling me this story, he's shaking his head saying, this is not a good idea, right? This is not like a good research idea for us, like to ask men like how they, because he had also been told that this wasn't really research for psychology. So I told him it was, and in fact, we collected all this data, I've published on it, and it turned out to be a really fantastic project. But these are two examples of fantastic, really creative young people taking our classes who didn't feel represented or didn't feel like a lot of the topics were addressing their particular ways. Does someone have their microphone on? Someone have a question? Okay, I'm getting a little bit of feedback. Okay. So I went back to the drawing board and I really started to work on my class and include all these different examples and different ways people might experience certain things and how we could use psychological theories to explain these differences and also similarities. And at the end of one semester, I got this written feedback. If you aren't pro-Black, pro-woman, pro-gay, pro-Muslim, you don't have a space in her classroom. And when I first read that, I kind of thought to myself, I can live with that. But then I started to think a little bit more and I thought, you know, did I fail to be inclusive? There was someone in my classroom who felt that they did not have a space. And then I thought on it some more and I thought a better question might be, how can I convey this information more effectively? There's something that they missed in my lesson. It wasn't about excluding anyone. It was, you know, I was trying to convey that, you know, there are different lived experiences, not just in the United States, but if we think globally. And, you know, somehow I missed this mark. So going back to the drawing board and thinking about the need to move beyond the idea of diversity as we have previously understood it, as simply understanding the differences between groups of people. And so thinking about diversity in terms of bean counting is insufficient. So just making sure we have 5 readings by Black scholars and 5 by Latino scholars and 5 by Asian scholars and 5 by white scholars is not, it's not nuanced enough. So we need new tools to do this. So again, just a recap, and I want to point out these keywords because it's really, really important for understanding how to use intersectionality. So again, so APA is advising that we need to attend to intersections, power differences, diverse identities, but also in multiple contexts. So it's not just diverse identities in the workplace. It's about thinking about how these shift depending on context. And we really need to think about how do we do this throughout our curriculum? How do we infuse these lessons throughout the classes we teach? Okay, so if we're thinking about these ideas, right, we're gonna need different tools. Oops. we have these goals for our students, so the development of behaviors for professional and personal settings, contributing to positive outcomes in work settings, and in building a society that's responsive to multicultural global concerns. And so as teachers, we are supposed to be, right, doing this for our students, but also how do we, as professors, embody these lessons? And so in order to do this, we are going to need different tools, new tools. So again, we have this language throughout, right? Benefiting the community, strategies to facilitate social change, global concerns, application, right, to public policy, and serving others. This is all community psychology, right? So, key concepts embedded in intersectionality include privilege. This is Kim Case. She's a leading expert on privilege studies, and she's written a lot about different types of privilege. So white privilege, male privilege, heterosexual, cisgender, Christian privilege. And so I bring her up because I use her scholarship in my teaching, but also it's a resource for those of you that don't know her work yet. Another theory that I use was written by Freiberg and Townsend on the psychology of invisibility. Now, this is really important to the course that I'm going to begin to talk about. In this piece, they argue that the absence of social representations about one's own group makes it difficult to imagine possible selves. Now, this is really important for our students, as Rainey, Shah, and Juan demonstrated. They didn't see themselves represented in the curriculum. So it's really important that we start to think about how do we do that in a way that is not Bean County. And this lack of social representations about others makes it more likely that we rely on stereotypes to fill in the gaps in knowledge. So if I'm not learning about a particular group of people, I'm going to rely, research shows we rely on our stereotypes to fill in those gaps. So we must, for even our most privileged groups of students, present this information to them, but again, not in a way that stereotypes or reinforces those stereotypes. Any questions before I move on? Okay. So let me start to talk about intersectionality then. So thinking about the evolution of diversity. Intersectionality demands that we understand the context that we are researching our groups of people in the context that they exist in. So intersectionality was developed by women of color. So this involves, there's Black women writing at the time, Chicana women, Puerto Rican women, Asian women, Native women. They're all writing about this in the 70s and in the 80s. Also lesbian, bisexual, transgender women, women with disabilities. So these women on the margins are starting to write about, we simply cannot think about gender as the sole oppressive, identity or subordinate identity. And they argue that we need to examine intergroup differences. So race within gender. So the origins of the term itself comes from legal studies. So Kimberly Crenshaw in her seminal piece, Mapping the Margins. And she talked about how social structures and resources are differentially accessible, but also basically that the world responds to different groups of people differently. We all don't get the same treatment. The argument here is also that social identities are embedded in culturally specific systems of power and hierarchy. And as I mentioned earlier, there is a differential access to resources, so education, to the legal system, representation in the media, but also in political movements. A couple of years, a year and a half ago, students in the course I'm going to talk about in a second, they wanted to look at the Me Too movement a little more closely. And they demonstrated how, again, it was a replication of the privileging of white women's experiences. And so Black women, again, got left on the margins. Okay. So understanding all of this has implications for how we understand psychological processes and outcomes. So again, key ideas. Intersectionality helps us examine intra-group differences. Social identities are embedded in culturally specific systems of power and hierarchy. Different groups have different access to resources. And this has implications for understanding psychological processes and outcomes. So as community psychologists, how are you already addressing some or all of these points? And I imagine that some of you are. So maybe take a few notes so we can have a discussion a little bit later. All right, so before I move on, I want to make an important point. Intersectionality is not about uniqueness, and it's also not about diversity. It is not a list of social identities. It is not about standing up and describing someone, their race, their gender, sexual orientation, ability, status, et cetera, et cetera. That is not intersectionality, that is describing a person. It is about power and privilege in social identities, and this is context specific. So you may have more or less privilege depending on the context, and I'll give some examples of what that means. So it is not who people are. Intersectionality is not who people are. It's about how things work. And I'm going to, again, give you several examples of what that looks like. Okay, so goal 3, ethical and social responsibility in a diverse world. So I'm using these words as privilege, oppression, right? Also, which I'll start to talk about. How do we engage what we cannot see? So Abby Stewart and I wrote a piece a few years ago about how to address privilege and oppression in the classroom, in the psychology classroom. So privilege is difficult to see. So when we start to talk about privilege to our students, raise your hand if you've attempted this. For those of you on screen, sometimes there's this defensiveness, right, about privilege. And that's because it's difficult to see the systems that may privilege us in particular. So the media, education, law, culture, there's always that one example they can provide that will say, no, it's not all like that, right? This one time I saw, or this one time someone said or did. Oppression then is also difficult to see how these same systems oppress others. So as psychologists, it's really important for us to consider how as teachers ourselves, our partially informed worldviews inform our research, our teaching, and activism. And I want to make this point here because when we start to understand our own partially informed worldviews, it makes it, I feel, for me, a better teacher because I can listen to my students as they're bringing in their perspectives instead of, that I know everything as the teacher. And the example I'm going to show you on how to do this in the classroom will demonstrate why this is also important. Okay, so intersectionality in psychology in particular. Liz Cole wrote this fantastic piece published in American Psychology, 2009. It's a great piece. And she offers 3 questions for us, as psychologists, to guide us in our research. The first one is, who is included within this category? And this involves attending to diversity within social categories, as I mentioned before, such as race within groups of women. And this is to understand whose needs are being privileged. So for example, when we talk about the wage gap, we tend to always talk about how it's 78-ish cents on the dollar. But when you look at race within gender, we see that the breakdown, it actually looks worse and worse depending on the group that you're a member of. So looking at African-American women at about 62% cents, and then Latina women around 54 cents. The second question she asks is, what role does inequality play? So this challenges us to consider hierarchies of privilege and power that structure social and material life. So an example of this is race and gender as social constructions. These are not the characteristics of a person. These are actually social constructions. And so here, the psychology of invisibility helps us understand how this works. Freiberg and Townsend argue that social representations of race and gender inform us of what is possible. And then where are the similarities? So this last question encourages coalition and collaboration based on commonalities rather than assuming differences among groups of people. So an example would be gun violence. And here privilege helps us, this is where privilege, we can point out how privilege operates. Although we're all affected by this issue, so whether we are pro or would like to see some more policy around gun ownership, but we're affected differently depending on which groups we're members of. So how and why that difference occurs is going to differ based on race, on gender. I think, what was that example recently where there was a Black security guard that had stopped someone and the police showed up and they shot him because he had a gun on him? So open carry, right to carry, Second Amendment doesn't work the same way for everyone. So here, privilege will help us understand. Any questions before I move on? Nope. Okay. All right. So I am going to give an example of a semester-long project that I use in a course that I teach titled Psychology of Gender, Race, and Sexuality. It is a master's level course, but it is amenable to undergraduate courses. And as I go along, I'll talk about that. And then when I'm done giving you the examples of what that looks like, I will explain how you might implement this into an undergraduate course. So in this course, students understand that they're going to learn about social justice via experiential learning. The key concepts that that frame the course are intersectionality, invisibility, and also privilege and oppression. And the project that runs throughout the course, throughout the semester, is the Intersectionality project. So Kim Case edited a book on intersectional pedagogy. And if you would like to read more about how I implement the course, about the course readings, etc., I co-authored a chapter with 2 of my graduate students. But there's also all kinds of fantastic chapters on critiques of intersectionality, future directions, current trends, as well as lots of different exercises that you can use in your classrooms. Okay, so for my course in particular, key learning goals involve understanding that people have multiple social identities and there's power and privilege in each of those. People's lived experience changes at these intersections. Also, I want my students to understand how privilege maintains systems of inequality. Key intersections where students feel uncomfortable, in my experience, has been that white men feel defensive about their privilege. And then women of color are also defensive because they don't recognize their privileged statuses. So as we move through the semester, the goal is to understand how to use our privilege to empower ourselves and others versus feeling defensive about them. So one, to acknowledge, okay, I have this. So how do I use it to empower not just myself? How do I tap into that? But just for others as well. And I'll give some examples of what that looks like for people who might feel particularly marginalized. Okay, so in the first 3 weeks, we're doing a lot of foundation work. So we're talking about intersectionality, and there's different types of intersectionality. So structural, political, representational, and this is always in context. We're also talking about intersectional invisibility, and this is Valerie Pretty-Vaughn's work. So we're looking, there's a close examination of marginalized identities and issues of prototypicality. Who is a prototype of particular groups? So when we say white women, when we say women, we think of white women, right? When we say Black people, we tend to think of Black men. We also talk about intersectionality in psychological research, so reading Elizabeth Cole's work. And then we talk about intersectional political consciousness, which is Ronnie Greenwood's work. And here she talks about how do we create these groups with diverse people who might feel like they have all these different issues, but we're really talking about reproductive justice. So how do we make those groups feel cohesive? And so she does a wonderful job of describing her research and then how we might accomplish that. And then we talk about privilege, oppression, and how they work. So we unpack the invisible knapsack, Peggy McIntosh's work. And then we also talk a lot about oppression as a pattern of forces or barriers, which are also related to each other, and they jointly restrain, restrict, or prevent motion or mobility. This is Marilyn Frye's work, her classic piece on oppression. Oppression is also a sticking point for students, where sometimes they argue, well, you know, sometimes I have a hard time, or, well, because I'm whatever, you know, I didn't get that job. And so the discussion here should be around, like, everyone has a hard time. You should, as a human, you should expect to have challenges in your life. This is about a pattern of forces or barriers. And then finally, we talk about the psychology of invisibility. Something else that I use to frame my teaching are some best practices outlined by Bain in the book, What the Best College Teachers Do. And here, best practices include experiential learning, which occurs through a highly authentic, fascinating project that challenges students' thinking. And this involves collaboration among students, a sense of ownership for them, and I'll give examples of what that looks like in the project, and then an authentic outlet for them. And then also us as teachers reminding them of these greater learning goals, because as y'all know, sometimes students will say, like, I don't get the point of this. I will never apply Freud's psychosexual stages of development in my workplace, ever. So reminding them of the larger goals. Okay. So I want to ask you then, before I move on, to also jot down some notes that I hope will be useful for our discussion at the end. How are you facilitating these practices? So collaboration among your students, but also perhaps among, you know, as the teacher and the students, or if you are having them collaborate with the community. How are you facilitating a sense of ownership for them in the classroom, for their learning? Are you assigning projects that provide or allow them to create an authentic outlet? So some kind of product. And then how do you remind them of the greater learning goals throughout the semester? Okay, so here let me talk about the intersectionality project. So ownership component. So the first step of the intersectionality project is choosing a social issue. So as a large group, so as a class, and this takes quite a while because they have, like, you know, 100 issues, and, you know, it's kind of funny because I'm like, really, you want to research? So, you know, so it takes a while to get it narrowed down to a shorter list. So as a class, they have to agree on one social issue. So these are just some of the issues that the classes, my classes have voted on. So before same-sex marriage was the law of the land, they wanted to research marriage laws, addiction, sexual violence. Then in smaller groups, they choose, and I have intersections in quote here because sometimes they say, I want to look at African Americans. So that's a single identity of race, but just let them do it, because as they go through the process, they're going to say the research looks different for Black men and women. So, so they'll start to see those intersections. So they sign up for these smaller groups, so in groups of 3 or 4. So here they're considering race, gender, sexuality, and how this is going to change how different groups are affected by the issue. So those are steps 1 and 2 for this project. Step 3, they are required to involve themselves in some kind of intervention. And this is also in their smaller groups, that they are coordinating with a community organization. So this is about the collaboration. Then the creation of products. This is the authentic outlet that Bain recommends. So here they're either collaborating with the organization who might say, yeah, you know what, we don't have any brochures, and if you could make this, here's what we need. Or social media outlet that they might utilize to spread the word. So here they have their authentic outlet, and it seems that they become very committed to the project when they know it's going to be sort of public. Students have written letters to senators, to local representatives. So there's all kinds of things they can do. Then how do you remind them of the greater learning goals? Because they're reading all this stuff every week. It's a different topic. They're running all over the city trying to figure out what are they going to do. So writing assignments. I have them write reflection papers for each module. So the psychology of gender, race, sexuality, which is never just about gender, race, or sexuality. And so they're writing reflection papers, and for each paper, they revisit these foundational concepts. So intersectionality, invisibility, privilege. For each paper, they must revisit those. By paper 2, they're complaining about redundancy, but by the end of the semester, they're like, oh, I understand it way differently now. So, it's about practice, practice, practice. This repeated application allows for the mastery of the theories. And at the end of the semester, we review their first paper and what that looked like, how they were understanding it. By the end of the semester, it's a much more sophisticated grasp of these different theories. And it helps them build skills. They're using evidence to support their interpretation of the issues. So for each paper, they're practicing building. Use that evidence. You can say whatever you want, but you got to support it. And as I mentioned, these reflections become more sophisticated with each paper. So the final exam in this course is a group presentation. And again, they are focusing on a single social issues and then their overview of their intersection in their smaller groups. In this final presentation, they make connections between course material and their activism. And they are applying the key foundational theories, so intersectionality, privilege, and invisibility. So I'm going to give you an example of one class that wanted to work on addiction. So this class chose addiction. And so as I mentioned, they choose one social issue. Then we brainstorm these intersections. Which groups do you want to look at? And so this particular class, again, these singular identities, so Native Americans, intersection perhaps of race here with the African American teens, veterans, and then affluent white men. So these were the groups that the class chose that they wanted to do research on. So again, we are choosing one social issue. Then the students choose the intersection they'd like to work on. They have to choose a type of activism. So do they want to work with an organization? Do they want to start to develop, what is the most effective letter? How do you write an effective letter to a senator? Do you want to create a Facebook page? All that stuff. Okay, so then they have to carry out the activism, and then they present on how it went. Okay, So put your teacher's caps on here, because naturally these aren't perfect analyses, but this is what they learned. Okay, so this first group examined the experiences of affluent white men. So the intersection of social class, race, and gender. And so here they argued about representational intersectionality and the media, and how the media makes external versus internal attributions depending on the race of the person. So they noticed here in their research that white men have a hard time versus men of color make bad choices. So again, external versus internal attributions. They also applied structural intersectionality, and they argued that the legalization of marijuana, so that white men would get rich selling it, and men of color would go to prison for smoking it or just being in possession of it. So they were looking here of use versus rates. Arrest rates differ, with white men faring much better than black men. Also applying structural intersectionality, they talked about the high cost of rehab, and it prohibits most men from attending. They found that in-treatment facilities tend to be located in affluent neighborhoods. So there's also differential access to health insurance. African Americans and Latino Americans are most likely to be uninsured in the US, and especially in Texas. And so here they argued also that income and immigration status would matter in this context. So for their activism, they wanted to use Facebook, and they argued here that most people have access to it. It's no cost to have an account. And here they wanted to highlight white privilege. And they noted that many people were reluctant to comment on posts about white male privilege. And they argued that this highlights how systems of privilege and oppression are maintained through invisibility, so the lack of public support. They also noted that there was a lot of victim blaming, with the assumption that people of color are the addicts. And they argued that this highlights how white men benefit from status quo. And then finally, they argued that privilege and oppression, that they understood it now, how these are systems of oppression. And they applied relative invisibility and framing of issues by the media. So one group is represented in the sanitized way, while the latter is demonized for the same or similar issues. So this is all psychology, and we know this. And then something that I really want my students to understand is the importance of coalition work. And here they reported that activism must be continuous, don't stop, that it's also vital to know how all systems relate to each other, so we can identify common sites of resistance. Any questions? No? Okay, one more example. Another group examined Native Americans, and here they applied relative invisibility. And this is the idea that we might have some social representations of a group, but it's very limited, or it's very stereotypical, or people are static, they're frozen in time. And so they started their presentation by talking about one of the group members, her personal memory of a documentary as a child, and then she realized that she hadn't really learned anything about Native Americans since. And so she argued that there was a static representation of Native Americans in our collective imagination. And they applied oppression, and they provided a historical overview of the bars of the birdcage, so these interlocking, the pattern of barriers and challenges, boarding schools, alcohol introduced by Europeans, etc. They also applied structural intersectionality, differential access to resources, isolation on reservations, high rates of poverty, disenfranchisement among Native Americans, and they argued that this is one of America's best kept secrets. Then they wanted to do some activism, and they found that there were no organizations in Houston that serve this particular population. And instead they had to research other states. to find organizations who did serve, in particular, the Native American community. So for their activism, they wanted to apply intersectional political consciousness. And here they argued that Native Americans have specific needs. And if we're going to be good allies, that we have to be attuned to those differences. And they reflected on their own process for activism, that they had these expectations versus reality. They kind of had this, save the day sort of mentality. And they realized that activism and social change takes time and perseverance, and that they had these implicit assumptions about the clientele, and they learned that one size doesn't fit all, that there are specific needs based on the community you're working with. Oops. And finally, privilege. In spite of holding their own marginalized identities, gender, race, they were all women of color, they recognized that they had many privileges that they could count on every day, including positive social representations of their groups, access to healthcare, and educational institutions. And then they thought about their own actor-observer bias, and they said that we imagine we can see all important aspects of a situation, and in reality, our viewpoints are partial and incomplete. So I want to give you next a little bit of flavor for one of my co-authors, Jackie Harris. So she graduated a few years ago, but she completed this course, and her class chose the topic of marriage equality. And their intersection was same-sex parents, and they were thinking about the legal system, same-sex couples, and adoption. So marriage equality is not just about two people getting married, but also it also involves family. And so she wrote, my group included 2 white students, 1 African American, 1 member with a cognitive disability, and 0 sexual minorities. Therefore, none of us had direct experience with the cause. I learned that activism goals can be realized when group members have an intersectional political consciousness and understand that among diverse group members, they may not all experience the same issue in the same way. At the time, I was more focused on doing well in the course rather than understanding my group's similarities and differences in our individual perceptions of the topic, communication style, and contribution of ideas for activism. I could have been more patient and understanding of our differences if I was thinking intersectionally. In the end, I made accommodations to allow all of our points to be heard and appreciated, shared with my classmates the group's difficult process, and emphasized the importance of making room for allies with similar concerns to encourage coalition building. And so she writes more in the chapter in Kim Case's edited book. Matthew Bowling was also in the same class, and his group wanted to look at white heterosexual couples. And here they're looking at the legal system, white couples, and divorce. So he writes, the discerning lectures that Dr. Rios administered, coupled with appropriate text assignments, small group work, in-class discussions, and student-led presentations, worked harmoniously to create an environment not just of learning, but deep understanding that became a pillar of my morality and worldview. I took away both group projects that it is one thing to memorize course material and regurgitate it on an exam, yet another to use the material as analytic tools and present my analysis to my peers. This learning process was enlightening because I had to mine the material finally to ensure my confidence in endorsing the concept of intersectionality when explaining it to others, reflect on my own ideas about masculinity, race, social class, and identify common interests at key intersections to promote coalition building among my peers. So, to recap, or to a few comments from this course that I teach. As community psychologists, we don't want them just to learn these ideas in theory, to be able to regurgitate them. We want them to feel like they're learning about, so I'll give you some quotes. So thank you for your passion and commitment. It it is hard to find people who are so dedicated to addressing the injustices of all people. So I'm not really doing that work, they're doing the work, but they feel like they're learning, right, about quote unquote all peoples. Dr. Rios is a great professor, pushes students to become better people, not just students. And ideally, we want them to go out and feel like they have these tools to become better, you know, that they are better people, that they're self-efficacious. I learned more about everything, and it made me realize there are a lot of things going on in the world and around me. So again, I'm not I'm not like all knowledgeable. I don't know everything, but they're bringing in all these different perspectives. You really made me think about life in a different way and how to use my privilege for the better. Ideally, that's what we want them to do, and we want them to do it. Okay, so how do we modify this for an undergraduate course? So I do it just tweaking it a little bit. Of course, I identify key concepts that I want them to know, and you have to make sure that you provide the reading and the lectures to support that intersectionality, privilege, etc. And then the weekly topics, so the theories from each chapter of the book. So if you want it to be more guided, so giving them a list of theories you want them to apply to their project, or I let my students choose whichever theories seem most interesting to them. So as a group, then they can select 3 or 4 social issues. So social psychology courses have selected like the Affordable Care Act, human trafficking, gender harassment. And this is more research-based. At my university, this is a commuter college. A lot of my students work full-time, so they're not always able to spend a lot of time volunteering at organizations or organizing events on campus. So this one is research-based, and I provide a lot more guidelines for the undergraduate. So a definition or overview of the concept or line of research applied. So in their presentations, they're kind of going step by step, right, what the theory is about. So for example, pro-social behavior. When do people help? So step by step, they want to itemize those things. A brief background or summary about their example. One class talked about Roger Ailes and Megyn Kelly. And then they thought about why people in the organization felt that they were or were not able to help. So how they interpreted it, was it an emergency or not, and why they stepped in or why they didn't. After several groups, so this is a rotating, right? They rotate every week, these different social issues. And so each week they're applying a different example. So by the end of the semester, we can talk about who received the most attention. So I'm using the Me Too movement here. Were all the women presented in our class for the 3 times that it was presented? Were they all helped equally, etc.? So you can see intersectionality. They're starting to understand that things do shift depending on social identity and context. Okay. So throughout this presentation, I've asked for you to jot down some notes to think about how are you addressing diversity into your courses, or how are you integrating, sorry. How are you already addressing intergroup differences, systems of power and privilege, differential access to resources, implications for psychological processes and outcomes, and then how do you facilitate collaboration, ownership of projects, authentic outlets for work, and reminders of greater learning goals. And so we can talk about all of those, none of those. I can clarify things. So that's the end of my presentation. I do want to say thank you very much for inviting me. I'm excited to talk with you. And then, of course, my wonderful students who have gone on to do all kinds of fantastic things in the community.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rios. So this is Lauren jumping in, one of the co-chairs of the interest group. Desi, I just want to say thank you again for joining us and sharing a specific case example, as well as providing so many fantastic citations and resources for us all to draw on. We'd love to open it up for questions. So folks, we want to encourage you, unmute yourself to share a specific question. You may also use the chat function. So if you hover your mouse over your screen for Zoom, you should see a little menu pop up, and you can see there's a little chat function you can click on. You can either send that directly to Jen Wallen-Rushman, or you can send it to me, or send it to the whole group, or directly to Desi, whatever feels comfortable. So we'll open it up for questions.
Remember that you can unmute yourselves to speak, or you can enter your questions in the chat box if you like.
Well, I'll go ahead and ask one.
Okay.
One of the things that I really struggle with when doing these applied projects, I love the deep, rich description of this project you've used, thinking through supervision within those groups. And so one of the things I've heard from students, particularly a lot of my group work ends up being around sexual violence, and survivors in those groups will describe really problematic things being said that are harmful, or racist things being said within groups that people aren't aware because they're still developing. And so I'm wondering if you can say more about how you approach those kinds of issues or provide supervision to students while they're doing the work throughout the semester.
So again, I think it's really important for us to model behavior, as I mentioned earlier. So thinking about how we embody those lessons. Throughout the semester, they are also doing small group presentations. So this is like their final exam, this project. But every week in different groups, they are presenting on, chapters 1 and 3 of a book. And then next week it's 4 and 6. And so every week we are discussing these issues and we're applying these concepts. And so it's slowly building. And within those discussions, we are talking about privilege, oppression, how some of those comments are harmful, partial worldview, how we may not be considering things. At the beginning of the semester, we also set up guidelines for respectful behavior, because we are talking about topics that are going to be really personal and perhaps painful, may trigger people for various reasons. One of the things I think that we forget is that sometimes we say things that seem really offensive, but we didn't mean to. So how do we recognize that we did that and not feel defensive about saying, I'm sorry, that's, I didn't mean it that way. But also allowing the room for that to happen, that growth to happen, rather than just shutting it down. You're a racist or you're a sexist. But also, so doing that early on, recognizing you're going to make a mistake, and probably your professor is too. You're going to say something that seems highly offensive, not on purpose. But how do we talk about that and own it? And then make sure that we tell our peers that we did not mean to harm them. So I think that's work that we don't do in the classroom. It's rather like, how do you always be polite and nice? And then some of that real conversation doesn't happen because we're so worried about talking perfectly, presenting it perfectly. I don't know if that helps. That's how I do it. So far, nobody's thrown any apples at me, or tomatoes.
Hi, this is Elizabeth. Can I ask about how you come to a single issue, and how you sort of bring everybody into the idea of owning that and being excited about that issue? Because I'm imagining that sometimes that would work really beautifully, and sometimes it would be, 2/3 of the group wanted to do this, but a third really wanted something else. And I'm just curious, are there some exercises you use or a process that you go through to help them come to a single issue that they can feel some ownership and excitement about?
So the excitement is going to come in different forms. So it might not be your top choice, like that wasn't the social issue I really, really wanted, but I don't know that much about Asian women in the United States. And so I'm really going to push for that as my intersection. And so there's different ways that they can get what they really want. So you might not get your social issue, but you might get your group. And that seems to be enough to get them excited. And it's actually a messy process. So the week before I say, start thinking about what you're paying attention to in the world, what seems to be really drawing your attention. And then next week, we're just going to write it on the board, all the issues. Sometimes they get a little carried away. So you got to, rein it back in. And then it's time limited too. You have a half hour. So decide, what can you not live without and what can you live with? And it usually turns out fine, especially reminding them that, wait, we have a round 2 of choosing our smaller groups. So even though you might not have gotten the issue that you really wanted, your smaller group work will likely, because there's more choices there. So likely if you really want to research.
Yeah, thinking about this, the multiple stages and choices along the way, that's really helpful. Yeah.
And they seem to like it. They seem to there's a lot of complaining along the way because it's so much, oh my God, it's so much work. But by the end of the semester, when they're presenting, you can just see their body, like they feel proud and they feel knowledgeable and self-efficacious and they feel really good about it. Yeah.
Thanks.
I want to point out too that sometimes they're just not able to get the activism part done. And that in itself is a process. And so they write about that and they present all the clumsiness that they went through. And that's really important for them to learn, but also their peers to hear that this work is not perfect. And that's okay, because you learn a lot from those mistakes. And so in that case, they come in and they're very distraught and, oh my God, and I'm going to get an F and all this stuff. And so walking them through, how can you present this in a way that demonstrates growth, that you did learn something and that you can share with your peers? Like, don't fret, because at the end of the day, we realized we wouldn't do it like this again. So we recommend to the rest of you, don't do it like this. So that's important too, to provide space for them to make a lot of mistakes. Yeah.
That's great. We have a question that was posed through the chat window. Have you had the experience when students have really changed their views about power and privilege from their perspective by the end of the course?
Yes. Oh gosh, I wish I had my written comments. There was one that said, at the beginning of the semester, I thought she had an agenda. But by the end of the semester, I realized that her agenda was to help us understand the world from different perspectives. So, yes. Yeah, I get written comments. I thought she was a feminazi and these sorts of things. But then I realized And I encourage them, you can write whatever you want, but you need to support it with psychological science. And so that helps them develop their critical thinking skills, Did I answer your question, I hope? Person that wrote in.
They wrote, thank you, and said, yes, thank you again, with an exclamation point.
So the comment you read from the student made me think of something. So when you're doing large projects like this, I feel like there's always a level of ambiguity, and that ambiguity is a place where they can, insert what they've learned and make it meaningful. So I think it's important. But sometimes I think when there's ambiguity and also part of what you want them to take away is process, which they might not be used to thinking in that way, there does become a level of like fear and worry about the grade that sometimes feels like it just hampers the experience and hampers learning. So I know the student writes about moving past it, but I just wondered if you could speak through, like, you know, the things that you've learned to help students kind of get through that so they can get to what you really want to take away and get past worrying about the grade.
Yes, so I write more about that in the chapter, but there are many projects along the way. So they submit possible avenues for activism or intervention. And then we talk about those carefully, because I don't want them going out into the world being, you know, to save the day and being totally counterproductive. So, you know, so there are many assignments along the way where they are reflecting on their privilege and how that might translate into their behavior out in the world. Partial perspectives, they write about, so the possible organizations, pros, cons, if they're going to be able to access those. And then there's a second mini write-up from the group where they talk about how that went, how they approached it. And so there's discussions about respectful ways to do that. Sometimes they're not comfortable. They're like, I just don't feel informed enough to go work with like a organization that addresses the needs of Black women. Like, I just, as a white woman, I don't. So we talk about perhaps then other ways that they might make an intervention in the world. So sometimes they'll create Facebook pages where they're interacting with their white friends, you know, to talk about these issues and the things that they're privileged, you know. So that's one way. So there are many assignments along the way. And then I have detailed grading protocol as well, so that they know what they're going to be graded on. And the truth is, everybody gets an A in this class. It's not about, again, you know, can you identify the right answer on the multiple choice question? But it is about the process and application. And these are the key concepts you need to apply. And I think the only time someone got a B was when they like didn't write the papers or something. Yeah. So at the beginning of the semester, I tell them that too. If you just do the work, I promise you'll be fine. Just do the work. Yeah. And I have group meetings with them throughout the semester too. The first meeting is a required meeting. They get their first like 100 points or something. So it's kind of, no, it's not required, but they get their first 100 points. And so they all come because they want those points. And we start to lay down the foundation, their ideas, what they're thinking. So it is a lot of training them, more like individualized, one-on-one in smaller groups. And then throughout the semester, they come back to ask questions. And that seems to alleviate a lot of it. Yeah.
One of the questions we just got that read my mind was, could you tell us, for context, the size of class that you're working with? And I'd also love to know if there are prerequisites for the course, or sort of the typical, where are people at in their experience on campus, how many years they've been there, things like that.
So for the graduate course, it's a level course, about 25 students, 20 to 25 students. It works with I've had classes of like, smaller classes of like 8 to 12, and it works as well too. They're usually in pairs though, in that case. So there's, you know, it's more work, but they seem to be fine. So those are master's level students. At the undergraduate level, where I mentioned doing 2 or 3, 4 social issues topics, and that is research based. So it's, you know, they're undergraduate, juniors, seniors. For some of them, this is the first time they're hearing about this stuff. But again, it's just providing more guidance, more structure for the undergrads.
And how big are those classes, the undergrad where you've ran it?
I'm sorry?
The undergraduate courses, what's the typical size of those?
Those are about 30 people, yeah. 30 to 35, yeah. And there I don't expect as the depth, but they seem to do okay. The last class we did, one of the topics was human trafficking. And one group did sex trafficking, but another group did labor trafficking. And so there the gender, component came in. And by the end of the semester, we were able to talk about privilege they were so wonderful. I mean, these undergraduates were amazing because they were talking about like job applications even. They're like, if you're a trafficked person and like, how are you going to get a job? Like, let's say you do get out of that and like, then you want to go back into the real world and people judge you if you haven't had a job in a while. So they were thinking about the system and how it works and how it discriminates against people. And they were saying like, who's going to not judge you if you're like, yeah, I was a sex worker for what? Because I got trafficked. Like, you can't say that. And our privilege, we don't realize how, and it was quite wonderful. I'm saying it kind of crudely, sorry, but I mean, they were much more thoughtful, but yeah, it was really incredible.
You mentioned just now that you have students where for some of them it's their first exposure to these ideas, particularly in the undergraduate context. And I wonder if you could say more about how that shows up in the classroom or how your strategy shifts when you have those kinds of varied preparation to engage in the topics.
So in general, I teach my courses differently than most psychologists, because in any course I teach, there are social issues involved. So theories of personality, I managed to get those in there. And so students aren't expecting that often. And so sometimes there is some backlash. I ask my students, one of my main goals is to develop that critical thinking. And so I invite them to state whatever it is, their ideas, their thoughts, their opinions, but they do have to support it with the science. And so that helps them, I think, develop the skill, those skills that we want, hopefully all of our goals in our teaching. So the critical thinking, the writing, all of my assignments though are very structured for students. So I'm trying to think, you asked me, how do I, for the first time that they're understanding, are you asking about intersectionality in particular, the question?
I think part of what I'm recognizing is that tension between, for folks who have spent a lot of time, who are probably really excited to be in your class and are like ready to go and be talking, specifically about how to apply intersectional thinking to social issues, and they're sort of ready to hit the ground running and do activism, versus the students who maybe your course fit their schedule, or they're very nervous about talking about it, and sort of bridging that gap, because I've seen in my classes a lot of frustration and resentment between the students, and sort of even when we do before the beginning community building, I think the really advanced students start feeling hampered, or the students who are further deeper in their socio-political consciousness and activism. So I guess I'm curious if you've developed any smart strategies for navigating that piece.
I do a lot of small group discussions where I will assign based on observations of who's, as you mentioned, more advanced in their thinking and their perhaps activism or whatever. And I do assign small groups. And so typically I'll have them do some kind of activity, and the team captain will be, and it's always the person who's a little, so they feel that they are not hampered, that they are teaching, they get to share what they know. And then the other students who are still learning, benefit from their peers. And I don't have to do everything, Yeah. And then those individual exercises, in class writing exercises, their papers that they submit. Those are, we know those are all useful for them based on where they're at. Yeah. Does that help? I don't know if that helps.
Definitely. I've never used the team captain model, so I like that idea as a potential strategy, and also support to you as instructor.
Yeah. Unofficial TAs. Yeah.
I just had another question come up. So are there any resources you would recommend to learn more about utilizing privilege to empower ourselves/others?
So again, Kim Case she has a lot of scholarship. She also has another edited book, Teaching and, oh great, I have a chapter in there and I can't remember the title. Learning and Teaching as Allies, I think it is, and it addresses privilege. And we all write about how we address that in our classrooms. So Kim Case, 2 edited books, so one on privilege and one on intersectionality. And that has multiple chapters, fantastic ideas, again, theoretical foundation as well as application in the classroom. I can submit to you my syllabus for this class if you'd like to be available to, yeah. And that lists the readings that I use. I used Michael Kimmel's Guyland. And after, I mean, I know there are some, there have been some students that have said, you know, some inappropriate behavior. So that's, I'm not sure, do I address that in the classroom when we talk about the scholarship and like, how do you, yeah, so that's going to come up this next semester. So his book will be on there, but I'm not sure if I'm going to use it again. Yeah.
I appreciate you acknowledging that tension.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not sure what I'm going to do yet. Yeah. Because you can't like sweep it away and pretend it didn't happen. And then at the same time, promoting the work of someone who isn't behaving appropriately. Yeah. So I don't know what I'm going to do. But I can provide that list. I have another list that I handed out at the Society for the Teaching of Psychology conference that has a whole bunch of stuff to read that is really useful. I think a great starting point though, oh, you asked for privilege. Kim Case's work, yeah, she's amazing. Yeah.
So you've talked about having students back up what they're saying, writing with evidence, which feels, you know, obviously so important. But I wonder if when you're more in a discussion context and less a writing context, if you want to like offer space for people to share their experiences and how you, in a discussion context, like balance those two things, or if you have students like speak specifically with like where they're coming from when they're engaging in discussions, that it might be unclear if it's kind of this is coming from evidence, this is coming from my experience.
So I do 2 things. So when the graduate students are leading the discussions, I have a format to guide them, which is part of their training. But the undergraduates also have a format. And that involves guided questions for the class. And that is so learning to write those sorts of questions to help with the application of the material. So making the connections between personal experiences and the theory that we're discussing. Sometimes it is appropriate to share personal experiences. And then it is at a certain point asking, you know, students, acknowledging those experiences and then asking them how, as a field, we might understand those better. As a field, how do we alleviate, you know, whatever the social issue is? How do we use the tools of our field to address those issues? So I try to tie it back into what we're learning, acknowledging that happened. And as we learned from the research, you know, this is a problem, you know. So how do we use our tools? for solutions. And then they start to talk about that. Does that help? Did I answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Especially when you're talking about social issues, it can go on and on about personal stories. So it's yeah, it takes practice to acknowledge and to situate that appropriately within, because we are there is material that we want them to learn as well, and to think about how do we develop solutions for these concerns that you're presenting, which are totally valid. So how do we use these tools? I feel like our field has so many amazing tools that can help, can help in the world, and I really want them to learn those, yeah.
Is it time to do a last call for questions, either typed or asked, with our, 6 or 7 minutes left? Is that an appropriately long teacher pause?
No.
Well, I just want to express our appreciation again. I've got so much out of today, and it came at such a good time. I'm thinking about preparing my classes for next semester, and so I personally have so many ideas to take into that from what you've told us today. And so I just want to thank you so very much for being here and sharing the amazing work that you are doing with us.
Thank you for the invitation. Can I say one last thing before we finish?
Of course.
So in the same way that we encourage our students it's okay to make mistakes, and that's a big part of learning is making those mistakes and getting comfortable with making mistakes. I think as teachers, it's important for us to recognize our own humanity, and that we also are going to make mistakes, but just try these things on for size and keep practicing yourselves. Reading the material, trying new exercises out, and being nice to yourself if things don't go right. Because sometimes students do get angry in these classes because they don't want to talk about these things, or they do feel really personal and they don't perhaps have those coping skills, And so it's just about being patient with not just your students, but with yourself too. And the more you practice, the better you get at it. And I want to remind us all to be nice to ourselves.
What a wonderful note to end our conversation on. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.